The French capital has been rocked by citywide protests. Tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets to protest against the nation's new security legislation. Protesters vented their anger against the security law, which would restrict the publication of pictures which show the faces of police officers on duty. Some 46,000 people marched in Paris alone, and 133,000 people marched across France. The number of rallies took place across the country against a provision of the law, Article 24. The new article is perceived to be undermining fundamental rights. It would make it a crime to publish photos or videos of on-duty police officers with the intent of harming their physical or psychological integrity. Anyone found guilty under the proposed law could be sentenced to up to a year in jail and fined 45,000 euros. French Parliament rejected a similar proposal earlier this year. The bill has been cleared in France's National Assembly's lower chamber but is pending in France's Parliament. Civil liberties groups and journalists are concerned that the measure will impede press freedoms and allow police brutality to go undiscovered and unpunished. The protesters carried red Union flags, French tricolour flags and homemade signs denouncing police violence. They also demanded media freedom and called for Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin's resignation. The peaceful protest turned violent when rioters clashed with the police, hurling bottles and rocks at them. Officers who were advised to behave responsibly during the demonstrations fired tear gas to disperse the rowdy protesters in the largely peaceful crowd. Riot police moved in to disperse demonstrators. After thousands gathered, officers also fired tear gas and scuffles also broke out. Prime Minister Castex announced on Friday that he would appoint a commission to redraft Article 24, but he backtracked after hearing from angry lawmakers. The commission is now expected to make new proposals by early next year on the relationship between the media and the police. A Bank of France branch in Paris was also set ablaze by the protesters demonstrating against police violence. Police fired tear gas and stun grenades after masked protesters launched fireworks, put up barricades and threw stones. The protests come after footage emerged of French police officers beating up a black man, triggering a nationwide outcry. 3 French police officers have been suspended after they were filmed beating and allegedly racially abusing a music producer in his Paris studio. The video showed the beating of music producer Michael Zeckler, following footage of the brutal police evacuation of migrants in a Paris plaza. President Emmanuel Macron said, "The images we have all seen of Michael Zeckler's assault are unacceptable. They shame us. France must never resort to violence or brutality, wherever they come from. France must never allow hatred or racism to flourish." Unquote. For more on this, we have Michael Kay, investigative journalist, who is joining us from Paris. Michael, welcome to Beyond. Thanks for giving us your time. This law hasn't yet come into effect, Michael, but we'll come to the protest. But first of all, explain, why does France even feel the need to bring in such law that obviously thousands of protesters and people across France feel will impede press freedom?
Well, yeah, good morning. Look, I think that's the sort of the core question, really. The provenance of why President Macron is trying to implement what is perceived by thousands to be a draconian law is quite bemusing. Now, look, I've been covering protests in France for many years now, and they do get violent. And there have been a significant amount of protests, especially from the Gilets jaunes, in the last 2 to 3 years, and they do get violent. Now, one of the problems with protests in France is that the protests get infiltrated by many groups. Black Bloc, for example, is a group that comes along and its sole aim is to just create havoc and create turbulence and instigate violence. So, a lot of these protests ramp up quite quickly because not the core protest is violently protesting, but it's been infiltrated from groups all over Europe that come in with that specific aim. So what I don't want to do is undermine the seriousness that the police officers in France, the violence that they face. They do face significant violence. I've been on the front lines with police officers, French police officers, with my freedom, with my press pass, and it has, they have respected it. They have let me come in right behind them to document with my camera, to report with my camera, and it's they've been very good with me. That's my particular experience. Looking more broadly, though, liberty, equality, fraternity, that is the national motto of France. And freedoms are the bedrock of democracy: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press. And I think this law is, it's going to be hard to pass. And if it does pass, it's going to be hard to implement. It's going to be hard to for the police to actually police that law. Absolutely. To try and figure out who's doing what. But there is a big thing here, and I think President Macron needs to be careful in that there's a hypocrisy to this. And what I mean by that is, Charlie Hebdo, which is infamous for the satirical magazine that has been back in the headlines because of publishing caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad. President Macron has defended that. Right. He's defended the right to free speech, and he's vehemently defended that, and that is causing violence at the moment, rightly or wrongly obviously, but the argument of whether those cartoons should be put out is a debate. Right. So I don't understand how President Macron on the one hand can vehemently defend freedom of speech and freedom of thought, yet Absolutely. On the other hand clamp down so seriously on the freedom of press. They seem to be two opposing ideals that he's trying to push.
Isn't it? And, they have caused such widespread demonstrations, Mikey. Over 46,000 people walked in Paris alone. Some reports say that close to 130,000 people took to the streets across France. So it's a widespread protest. You were mentioning that it was largely peaceful. Of course, some elements created violence during the protest, and no one is doubting the integrity of every French police officer. French police also will have to take action. If there is violence, they will have to control it. But it's cases like the case of Michael Zechler, isn't it? Such cases will go unpunished. It will restrict the media from their pursuit of justice. Michael Zechler, he was assaulted by French police officers inside his studio. Some reports suggest he was racially abused. So how do French lawmakers justify this law that will prevent cases like Michael Zechler from coming out?
A simple answer is I don't know, because it's not just Michael Zechler in France; it's George Floyd in the U.S. And the George Floyd incident, where George Floyd was the black African American that had his throat suppressed by a police officer's knee and eventually killed him. That sparked a huge movement across the United States of protest, Black Lives Matter, because of the injustice to Black Americans inside the U.S. Slightly different sort of situation you have in France, but the core principle is the same: is that freedom of press is the core bedrock of holding truth to power, and if you start eating away at that, I mean, this is something that you would sort of expect from someone like Russia or a dictatorship. You start basically eating away at the ability to hold people to account, and that's not just if it starts with this law, then it can slowly slip and form into other laws, and that's the problem that you've got. As a journalist that is reporting on the front lines, we have to report the truth. We have to report what we see. Mm-hmm. So the efficacy of the law, in terms of how effective the law will be, initially I think it will create more havoc and more turbulence, because people aren't going to accept what's going on. This is France we're talking about, mm-hmm. And if the French people think that something isn't right, they'll just protest even more. Place de République is the center of of protest inside France and inside Paris, and people come together around that monument, which I live about 10 minutes away from there, without any hesitation whatsoever.
Right.
And I think if Macron is creating a situation where you're going to get more protests, that's going to allow more people who are coming, like Black Bloc, to come in to create violence. And the situation, this is a law that will escalate the situation rather than de-escalate the situation.
Absolutely.
So there has to be other ways.
Yes,
there has to be other ways to enforce what Macron is trying to enforce, which is protecting police officers.
Absolutely right, Mikey. In fact, Emmanuel Macron came out and said the images that they saw of Michael Zechler's treatment shamed France. So Macron also realizes that there are times when police need to be questioned. Journalists and people at large, French people across the world as well, people need to see that justice is being delivered, and that will be stopped if this law is introduced. Now, this also, Mikey, has the potential of setting up a dangerous precedent in Europe, because France may take the lead and other nations might also follow French lead as well. France has faced recent terror attacks. Yes, France has ramped up their security apparatus, but we feel that somewhere there needs to be a line which is very dangerous for France to cross, because it will set a dangerous precedent.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a really important piece here as well, is from the side of, in terms of accountability, it takes two to tango here. And journalists and news organizations have a responsibility to report context whenever they're showing clips. And so if news organizations are going to show a specific incident of violence when it comes to police versus protesters, or Black Bloc versus, protesters, or Black Bloc versus police, or whatever altercation exists, news organizations have a responsibility to make sure that they get that context absolutely right before they publish it. And I think that's hugely important. In today's landscape of social media, of quick hits, of quick clicks, of Twitter, of things to get people's attention, if you're gonna display an act of violence between one person and another, you have to ensure that the story behind that particular clip is 100% accurate at the
Absolutely.
time. And if it's not 100% accurate at the time, the news organizations have to really consider not putting that clip up before they do know the truth, rather than putting it up and then updating it as it goes along. Because as soon as that initial clip goes up with a headline, if that headline is deemed wrong, that clip could have already gone viral, and it's impossible. The genie's out the bag. So there's an accountability on journalists and news organizations as well in this.
Mikey K, thank you so much for joining us and getting us the latest as far as the unrest in France is concerned.